We're in chapter 23 of Acts. And if I can remember how this thing works. Okay. Today we're going to look at what happened right after Paul was in the temple trying to do a common ordinary ritual, helping some guys through their vow, when someone came by and saw him, someone from Asia. The text tells us that. Let's look at the text here. This is verse 30 of chapter 22. On the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews. He was accosted, he was assaulted by all these Jews in the temple who wanted to tear him limb from limb. And fortunately, the garrison there in Jerusalem, which is right next to the temple, heard the noise, and one of the centurions ran over there and snatched him out of the crowd. But the tribune, the guy in charge of these soldiers, he has to find out why everyone's so upset about Paul. So he, the tribune, unbound Paul and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. Let me ask you a general question here. Can you guys read that size of font? Okay, I think I've asked that before, and I always have doubts because I went through a period in my recent life where I couldn't read, the big letters on the screen. Okay, so he's got to have a reason for keeping Paul in prison. It's like today. You don't charge someone with something, you can't keep him in prison. You have to let him go. And so he's wondering, what's his sin? What's his crime here? Why are these people all upset? So he wants to determine if he broke any laws. He wants to have definite accusations or charges, which will help him proceed to know how to either punish or to let him go. Now, this is the 6th time that the Sanhedrin has been called, and the tribune insists on this. He wants a Sanhedrin to deal with this because they understand Jewish religion, and this happened in the temple. And this is, a long list of things that the Sanhedrin has to deal with once Jesus comes on the scene. The first one is after Jesus healed Lazarus, and everybody was all, amazed at what Jesus had done and how God was working through him. And of course, the Sanhedrin realizes they got to do something about this. This is the rival. This is the guy that's taking attention away from them. This is the guy that's criticizing the way they do business. So they met and decided that, hey, we've got to end his life. The second time was when Christ was accused of blasphemy. On the eve before his crucifixion, he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane by the temple police and brought to the Sanhedrin and judged. The third time, after Christ had died, resurrected, and ascended, Peter and John were in the temple, and they healed a lame man that could never enter the temple. He was always crippled, and the law forbade the fact that he would go into the... So finally, he was healed. He could jump and leap and run and go into the temple. Well, they had to call Peter and John into the Sanhedrin and tell them, you can't preach in this guy's name. And they said, is it better to obey you or God? The fourth time, they decided to get all the apostles in jail. And so they've decided that they're going to deal with these guys all in one shot. So they call the Sanhedrin together the next morning. Bring the apostles. We want to talk to them. They're not in the jail, sir. Where are they? They're out in the temple preaching and teaching. That was the fourth time. The fifth time, Stephen was brought before the Sanhedrin, and it looks like the express reason was to condemn him to death, which they did. This is the 6th time, and Paul is going to be accused of desecrating the temple, and we'll see in the chapters to come that they never have enough evidence to support this. Okay, so we're going to see our first blank to fill in, the Sanhedrin will hear Paul on this occasion. And let me just give you the second little line here. It's a painful start, especially for Paul. Paul does not have a pleasant experience as he comes to stand before the Sanhedrin. Now, it was his turn to speak. It's kind of interesting that they gave him a chance to speak. They did this with Jesus, and they said, "Tell us if you're the Son of God," because they had to hear it from his lips. So here Paul gets the chance to speak. And when he does, look what happens. Looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." So he's protesting his innocence. He says, "I haven't done anything illegal. In fact, I'm following, if we follow this mentally farther, I'm following the hope of Israel that we see in the prophets of a Messiah that will come and save us." And so he says, "I'm innocent." Okay, well, that doesn't bring about a very good result. The high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by Paul to strike him on the mouth. Now, the priest was not allowed to punish anyone before a decision had been made by the whole Sanhedrin. But this guy never played by the rules. This Ananias was well known for all the evil that he did from his office as high priest. He would steal the tithes that were given into the temple treasury to pay the priests. Everyone had to pay for the priestly families to give them food, to give them shelter, whatever they needed, and so a tithe was paid. But this guy would filch these tithes for himself. He would also take bribes because, as we see the Sanhedrin judges cases, they would give him bribes so he would judge in favor of them. And in the third place, he would send out his henchmen to assassinate his rivals. So this is a high priest, supposedly the most holy person, the one who had the words of God. And we see they do have the words of God on occasion when Caiaphas, for example, says that it's better for one man to die than the whole nation. And he was right. Jesus had to die. So this is the high priest, and look what he's doing. Just a reprobate in this position. He was eventually deposed a few years after this occasion here, and 7 years after that he was assassinated by his own people because they were thinking he was generating revolt in favor of Rome during the Jewish Roman wars in 66. So anyway, this guy shows up on the scene, does his dirty work, and then is eliminated because of his own evil. Remember that Jesus went through the same thing as far as being reprimanded by the high priest. John is the only one that mentions this, and I didn't put it up on the screen. But as I recall, Jesus was asked, "Are you the Son of God?" And he says, what's the big deal here? I've never spoken in private. I always speak in the synagogues and the temple. And someone near him smacked him on the mouth. And he said, "If I'm not speaking the truth, you have the right to do that, but I'm speaking the truth." So Paul and Jesus both went through this humiliation of being stricken by someone in a court of law. Okay, so then Paul says this. He responds to what happened. Excuse me, I've gone ahead here. Those who stood by him. I guess I didn't put that in here. Sorry. Those who stood by him said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." Now, this is a big question mark, okay? If he's really said that, okay, I put it up there now, is he admitting that he made a mistake? What does he mean by this? "I did not know that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." I think there's three possibilities, and I've seen lots of commentary on this. The first is that he was truly ignorant. Who is the high priest? He was not in Jerusalem a long time. He was all over Asia and parts of Palestine, and for many years he was not in Jerusalem. So was it possible that he didn't know, and that he felt that was just some member of the Sanhedrin? A second option would be that he was admitting he made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that since he is the high priest. The third possibility, he's saying, you're not recognizable as the high priest. You don't look like a high priest, the way you act. And so that's, if you were a high priest, a real high priest, I would not have done that. Of course, he wouldn't have slapped him either. So I would really side with the third option here instead of the other two. Well, what happens after he says this? We have an explosive testimony. Paul gets to say something else, and he's not going to waste his opportunity when this opportunity comes. We will see a stroke of genius on his part, how he responds to this whole volatile situation of these Jews that have the power of life and death over him, and as they did in the case of Jesus. And so he's going to answer in a very interesting way. Watch what he says here. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." We know he was a Pharisee. He tells us that in Philippians 3, when he goes through all that list of things that he thought were in his favor before he found Christ. And he said he treated all of them as manure compared with the riches of following Christ. So he says, I'm a Pharisee. So he's identifying with half this group, which is pretty interesting that he would do this. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Okay, now to understand what's going on here, all the politics and religion of this situation, we need to understand the differences between Sadducees and Pharisees. And so that's what we're going to do here. And I'd like to start with the Sadducees. They were evil people, and that makes me sad, you see. They were a wealthy party. They were the rich people, the elites. They always controlled the priesthood because they had a handle on politics. They knew how to get that done. And they prized power far above morality or spirituality. What really was important was that they maintained their place. And that even came out when they were talking about Jesus and Lazarus. The Romans will come and take away our place. They wanted that power. Also, as far as the scriptures go, they rejected the prophets and the writings. They only accepted the Pentateuch. That almost puts them in the category of Samaritans when you think about it. And there were some affinities between the Sadducees and the Samaritans. And in third place, they did not believe in resurrection, and they did not believe in spirits, whether good or evil. So demons or angels, they didn't exist, according to the Sadducees. Now, on the part of the Pharisees, believe it or not, they were respected by the common people. If you went to Israel in the early 30s, 40s, 50s after Christ and asked, who are the really spiritual people in your midst? They'd say the Pharisees. They're the guys that put the rubber to the road. They're the guys that are struggling to understand all the traditions that we have and to apply them in a right way so that we're not disobeying the law. They even took around with them lawyers called scribes who knew what all the rabbis had said. They had it right here, everything memorized. And the Pharisees can consult with them and say, hey, is this situation legal or not? Well, Rabbi so-and-so says no, but Rabbi so-and-so says yes. So they were really concerned about the law. in keeping the law. However, they didn't really use the Bible. They used what everyone said about the Bible. And so, although they accepted the whole Old Testament, Jesus caught them on many occasions with their traditions that violated the Scriptures. You followed the words of men instead of the Scriptures. Now, here's the point that Paul got to, the last one on the list. They believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed all would be resurrected someday, whether good or evil, to their end. And this comes from the end of Daniel, where Daniel is promised that he will be resurrected in the end, to see good. And so we have these two different perspectives in the Sanhedrin. I don't know what the percentages were. Probably Sadducees were less than the Pharisees in number, but they're more powerful in money and in privilege. So the Pharisees, Paul's going to identify with. He's going to say, it's for the hope of the resurrection that I'm here before you today. Okay, so to understand the irony involved in what goes on when this tumult strikes, Paul is siding with the Pharisees, but this just puts a wedge between the whole group. Half of them will say, okay, or not even half, a few of the Pharisees said, he's okay, we agree with him. The Sadducees thought he should be killed. And so we have this great clamor. It says, a great clamor arose. Some of the scribes of the Pharisees stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? Do you catch what they're doing here? Because the Sadducees don't believe in spirits or angels. So the Pharisees are taking this belief of theirs and they're just, rubbing it in. What if a spirit or an angel talked to him? Well, by this time, the whole assembly is almost in fisticuffs. We've seen this recently. In some countries of the world, they'll show on CNN the Ukrainian parliament or something where they're all punching each other, or even in Korea this happens once in a while. I think within the next 10 years it'll be happening in the United States probably. But it's pandemonium. And here we've got this poor tribune who's watching all this, and he's got to intervene again and save Paul's life, to drag him out of there so that he's not killed unlawfully. And he's still got no firm charges against him. Now imagine this poor tribune, what he's seen over the past few days. Here's a guy minding his own business in the temple. All of a sudden there's a tumult that breaks out, and he's almost torn limb from limb. And the tribune has to come in and save him. And on the way out, he says, let me say something. Oh, you speak Hebrew or Aramaic? Go ahead. And then another pandemonium breaks out. He gets him in prison, takes him down to the Sanhedrin. Another battle, between this man and everyone else. So he must be shaking his head by now. What a religion we have here. These Jews, look what they're doing. Well, at this point, Paul is probably pretty discouraged. He has been attacked on 3 different occasions, and now he's probably wondering, what is my future? Am I going to just stay in jail forever because it's too unsafe to let me out? What's going to happen to me? Well, here's where the Lord comes in. We get a word from the Lord's involved in everything, but here he makes his appearance to Paul. I get the impression that Paul is in his cell, on his feet, praying to God. And this is what the text says. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for if you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. Well, this is an encouragement in more ways than one. Let me just put 2 issues here that he can derive from this. 2 important items of encouragement. In the first place, Jesus is commending him for his testimony. How would you like that? Wouldn't that be wonderful to have the Lord himself say, you're a faithful witness, and you're going to get another chance? The second thing we can take from this, Paul's life is guaranteed. No one can kill him. No one can touch him until he gets to Rome. Imagine what this means to him in the days to come. There's going to be a conspiracy against him. We'll talk about that today. There's going to be 2 or 3 judgments of him in Caesarea, with people showing up from Jerusalem to try and badmouth his name and lead him off to execution. And then there's the ship voyage he's going to take to Rome. He knows he's going to survive because the Lord said, you're going to testify to me in Rome. It'd be great to be in this situation. Well, if our life is that important to us. But look at Paul. He's got an assurance from the Lord that he will continue on and to be effective for him. So the Jews are going to conspire against him. This is their next move. You know, they tried to get him tried by the Sanhedrin, and that failed. It didn't work because Paul kind of distracted everyone. There was an interruption, an interference in their plans. And now they're thinking, well, how are we going to get him judged and killed? Let's just skip the legal part. Let's take care of him. Okay, so what do? Well, from what follows, we know very well that the Sanhedrin is crooked as can be. Okay, but Paul was no stranger to plots. He'd had this happen before. Soon after his conversion, he's in Damascus still, and there's a plot to kill him. So they shuffle him out of there, and he gets to Jerusalem, and there's a plot there to kill him. And finally, the brethren take him or get him off to home in Tarsus. When he gets on his missionary journeys, he spends time in Ephesus in chapter 19. Then in chapter 20, another plot to kill him. And so he avoids taking the ship and goes by land to speak to certain people. And then we have the 4th time here in Jerusalem, a 2nd time that he's been plotted against. Now, there's some interesting qualities to this conspiracy. First of all, it's time sensitive. They made an oath before God, the people that planned to kill him. And this is to show how serious they are about getting rid of Paul. So they make an oath, and a vow or an oath like this in the Mosaic law is a promise made with such commitment that you take the curse of God upon you if you fail, if you don't fulfill your vow. So these Jewish radicals were so determined to kill Paul that they made an oath. And that's possibly for the purpose of assuring that all the participants saw it to its end. We're going to make an oath where we don't eat or drink until he dies. So let's see the details of this. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune and bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So they knew the tribune was honest. They had to fool him. They had to deceive him. But the Sanhedrin, no problem. Just be aware, we're going to kill him, so we need you to play along with us and help us out with this. Now, a vow made based on abstinence means that, it's got an end game. It's got to come to fruition at some point because you got to eat again. You got to drink again. But they knew they could count on the Sanhedrin to help them, and they thought they had their plans set to get rid of Paul. It's interesting that they scheduled the ambush for the next day. They didn't say, okay, down the road here a week or so, let's ambush. No, it's tomorrow because we're hungry. And so we all know that the plot never succeeded. So what about these guys? What became of them? Did they all die? From hunger? No. What we find is that the Jews have a way around all this stuff, you know. And so if you look in the Mishnah, there's a whole tractate, they call them. There's 6 tractates in the Mishnah about different subjects. Like one is about women. This one is about vows. It's called Nedarim. And it says, if a vow was made under duress or in a state of emotional turmoil, it may be considered invalid. Oh, a loophole. You know, this is the way out. And I think they were counting on that in case things didn't quite go right. So with all their friends among the leaders of Israel, it appears that they were given a break, that they didn't have to keep this vow, and they could go on eating and drinking, even if their plan failed. Now, it's funny that they never considered the fact that this vow in itself was totally against the law. I think Darrell Bock said the following: the irony is that they take an oath before God that actually violates God's standards and will. In Brazil years ago, one of my students told me about an example he heard in one of the bakeries. They call them padarias. They're where everyone goes to get their breakfast and coffee and fresh bread and all that. And some guy was sitting there drinking his coffee saying, that guy, I'm going to kill him if God wills. You know, because it's kind of common to say, if God wills, to everything. Well, good grief, you know God doesn't will that. It's just like here, God is not going to honor a vow that flies in the face of his laws. It violates God's standard and will. Well, the plot, thankfully, is discovered. When you have 40 plotters and 70 Sanhedrin members, the odds are the word's going to get out somehow. And it did. Paul, the son of Paul's sister had a son who learned of this plot. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. We have no evidence of the family of Paul other than this little snippet. We don't know if his family supported him. Probably not. No other really righteous Jews supported him that were of his Pharisaical group. And so it could be that this nephew simply wanted to preserve his uncle's life. Now the term used in the text is young man. We'll see later on where the tribune calls him a young man. But it looks like he may have not even been a teenager yet, because there's a text here we'll see where the tribune took his hand. You don't see that with a teenager, you know. It's probably some child maybe 10 years old, 10, 11, 12 maybe. And he's going to Paul in the Roman barracks to talk to him. Now that shows a great deal of courage. And then Paul tells him to go talk to the tribune. Wow. The head of all the soldiers of the area. So we have a young man here with a great amount of courage. It's possible that by the time the tribune heard this boy's story, because Paul sends him to the tribune, that he'd already received the request to have Paul taken to the Sanhedrin the next day. It's obvious he did not let anyone know what he'd heard from the boy, and he told the boy not to say anything. He swore him to secrecy because he wanted to get Paul out alive. Okay, the plot then is circumvented. That means it's avoided. Once news of the plot got to the tribune, he knew his commission could be lost if he allowed somebody to be assassinated on his watch. And this would be a very public, very publicized failure if this happened. He could be embarrassed, he could be deposed. And so he did all he could to head off the assassins. And what he did was to remove Paul from Jerusalem. That was the wise choice. Here's what the text says. Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers." What a coincidence. 2 centurions are to get 200 soldiers ready. Each one commanded 100, and so this was logical. They would both get their 100 soldiers ready. with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also, provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. We do have a little debate about the word spearmen here. It's a very obscure word in Greek, and some believe it may even refer to horses, extra mounts for the soldiers. Because let's face it, they made a big trip, 37 miles that night, the first night. And to see soldiers going 37 miles in one night, that's pretty quick pace. I mean, you don't run marathons, every night. And these are soldiers with gear, lots of weight on them, weapons, all this stuff, ready to fight. And so we think perhaps the 200 spearmen were actually horses for the soldiers that went with them, making virtually 270 horsemen, to 200 plus the 70. So we find these fellows leaving under cover of night. They left at 9 p.m. And the real goal here is to guarantee safe passage of Paul all the way to Caesarea. Okay, I had to abbreviate Claudius Lysias because I didn't have room on that line, okay? But it's in your notes, okay? So we have the name of the tribune finally. After all this grief, we finally get his name, and it comes in the form of a cover letter that he's going to send. It's kind of like a fax. He's faxing Paul down to Caesarea, and so he'll send a cover letter with this retinue of soldiers. So the name of the tribune, Claudius Lysias, appears in the letter. Paul probably heard this letter read. I've seen commentaries, well, how did Paul know what was in this letter? How did Luke find out? Well, Luke probably could have researched it and found out what it was. He probably could have gained access to it. He was a very noble person, knew how to research and investigate things. But I think Paul probably just heard him read this when he got to Caesarea. The letter sent by his centurions was probably read to Felix so that Felix would know the case. It says Felix read the letter, but I think that's the same meaning. Okay? And so he wrote a letter to this effect: Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued them, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. Where's the problem in all this? Is that true? What's wrong? Exactly. He didn't know Paul was a Roman citizen. He rescued him in the temple and then put him in jail and then was going to flog him, remember? And Paul said, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. That's when he found out. He didn't put that in the letter. I almost flogged him, but then I found out. No, I rescued him. So we have a little bending of the truth. But the rest of this is pretty legitimate, what he says. The letter continues. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or punishment. We need to listen to that last line. That makes really the point that Luke is trying to establish in Acts. That Christianity was not forbidden in the Roman Empire. Christianity was not a lawless religion like the Jews tried to make it look like. Paul was innocent, says Claudius Lysias, this tribune who has no axe to grind here. Paul was innocent. So due to the volatile conditions in Jerusalem, it made sense for the tribune to transfer Paul to the larger jurisdiction down in Caesarea, where there's a praetorium, like a palace with guards all over the place. It's almost like the armory, It's like taking a guy out of the county jail who's a real threat for assassination and sending him to a federal court with their way to detain him safely. And that's what this guy did. Okay? It's also obvious he wanted to pass on Paul's case. He didn't want to deal with this anymore. He hadn't succeeded in getting anything out of his two possibilities to hear the explanation. You know, Paul tried to explain to people in the temple, and they all got mad at him, and then he tried to say something before the Sanhedrin and didn't get anywhere that way. And so he's giving the responsibility to someone more important, which is really a good move on this part, because it will protect Paul. Paul would be protected by the governor's forces from radicals. And his accusers, who all lived in Jerusalem, would have to travel all the way to Caesarea, 65 miles, just to accuse him, which would mean smaller groups, probably a more controlled hearing location. Okay. So let's look at the journey. Luke loves journeys. I don't know if you've noticed this in Acts, but he goes into great detail when there's travels. And we'll see this in chapter 27, which I'm really looking forward to teaching about the ship's voyage. He's really giving us important information on travel. Okay, the soldiers move quickly, possibly help because they're descending. You know what it is to descend 2,500, half a mile to sea level in a very short distance? It's really hard on the calves. I've done this before. You wake up the next morning, oh, why did I do that? But it's pretty quick to go downhill like that. The return journey would not have been so easy. The text says, so the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. Okay, by sunrise then, they were in Antipatris, 37 miles from Jerusalem. And here I've got a map for you. Jerusalem is up in the right-hand corner. It's inside that little blue box. And if you look carefully at the terrain, because this map shows all the rugged terrain, the plateau that Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Ramah are on up there at the top, goes into foothills that are very steep, the Shephelah, and they land on the coastal plain. And so Antipatris is down there, down there on the coastal plain, where everything's level. You don't see any of these big gullies anymore. 37 miles, they made it that night. The next day, they go all on level ground to Caesarea, 28 miles. So that was their trip. And then we have the letter showing up in the hands of Felix. On reading the letter, he asked what province Paul was from, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Now, Israel was in the state in those days where there were a lot of little small domains, kingdoms, where a king was king over Iturea or over Nabatea, and so Felix had to be careful not to enter into the jurisdiction of another reign or another domain. But when he found out he was from Cilicia, which is north of Antioch, he realized, yes, that is my jurisdiction, so he agreed he would hear Paul's case. Paul would make the Herodian praetorium his home for 2 years. He would be detained, but he would have certain privileges. For instance, he would be allowed to have Luke with him. And I think a lot of the information we have throughout the book of Acts was Luke going around questioning people while he was in Caesarea and finding out what happened in the early church, finding Philip, who lived in Caesarea with his 4 daughters that were prophetesses, and finding out what happened in Acts 8, when Philip was transported into the desert. All these things seem to be coming to Luke because he's following Paul in these different locations. He would be free also, Paul there in Caesarea, to converse with Felix, the governor, which he did on various occasions. And then finally, he'd be free to represent Christ before Agrippa and Berenice, Agrippa, king of Israel. And so this gave him the opportunity to speak to some higher-ups while he was in Caesarea. Now, Felix was not a model governor. He was a one-time slave. He'd been promoted through the ranks of politics because his brother Paulus was a favorite of Claudius, the emperor. And the Roman historian Tacitus said the following: Antonio Felix, indulging in every kind of barbarity and lust, exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave. So my conclusion, seeing all that's happened in this chapter, and I'll just read this to you. It is noteworthy when Paul received the vision of the Lord standing by him, in verse 11, he was given one responsibility. He would be tried as he had been by the Sanhedrin 2 more times. But these future trials would not be before Jews, but Romans. But Paul was not told to defend himself or to seek justice. I find this to be very interesting. He was told not to seek justice in court. He was told to testify for Christ. This world is full of injustice and of unfair circumstances, but we are not here to make sure everything is done right by our government or by our society. Like Paul, we will experience various challenges throughout our years, but our overriding goal should not be fairness or even justice in these situations. I know this rubs us the wrong way. We want justice, and I think God's put that in our hearts. But when it comes to representing Christ, our slogan should not be, "I've got my rights." Our goal should be to testify of Jesus in the circumstances, whether just or unjust, everything he brings our way. And you know what? Judging from the life of Paul, I think we will have many more opportunities to testify of Christ in unjust situations. So we need to be able to absorb that, to say, God's doing something here, even though it's through others' injustice. And to be obedient. We see persecution throughout the world today. We have entire organizations militantly trying to resist persecution. But I wonder if maybe the persecution is what God's trying to use. It seems to work in China. It seems to work in Nigeria. It's worked for 2,000 years in the church. Let's not claim our rights. Let's claim our Savior when we face these trials. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this text. Thank you for the immense amount of information that Luke gives us and for the ability to see how you're working, Lord, in the life of Paul. Father, someday perhaps we'll see this highlighted in our lives in eternity, how you worked to bring about situations that would bring glory to you. I pray, Lord, that we might not short-circuit your plans. I pray that we might be faithful regardless of the injustices we suffer. And I pray that you'll prepare us for that so that we might be faithful witnesses for you. We praise you, Father, for your goodness to us in allowing us to participate in your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen.